Welcome to day 4 of the Sector 39 Permaculture Design course. Principle 4, systems, limits and feedback. This is a really big one. It's a really, really important one. And it takes a little bit of time to fully understand and think about. Let's start with the icon. Let's look at planet Earth. James Lovelock, we call him a physicist, biologist, whatever, scientist, called it Gaia. He gave it a name, and by that he meant he recognized that at one level, at a certain level, the planet Earth, the planet that we're part of, is a single living, very complex, interconnected, but it's a single living system. We could regard planet Earth as an entity in itself. And within that living system, we're confronted with reality is that everything is connected to everything else. That everything is a process of a chain of events. So in systems, a change in one part of a system might result in a very different change in another part of the system. But through the very nature of how complex the world is, it can be very difficult to predict exactly what that outcome will be, especially when you're thinking on a global scale. For me, the closer to home that we work, the closer to our own back door or our own personal experience that we work, then the more feedback we get, the more we're aware of the impact of the changes that we might make to a system. And so therefore, as designers, we realize is that we need to design very close to home and close to within our own experience. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. We've been encouraged to, I've started with the idea of thinking about systems, everything's connected, and on a certain meta scale is everything within this biological system that we are part of, everything is ultimately connected. Nature has limits. This is the next thing that we learn when we observe nature is nature is very generous and nature is very abundant. But if we keep taking and we keep taking and we keep taking, what happens is the natural system reaches a point where it cannot sustain itself anymore and it shrinks. It might even collapse. Often what happens is it's reduced to a small part of what it was before, a kind of just a holding pattern. So the saying that sits within this principle is quite haunting. It says the sins of the father are visited unto the seventh generation. Now, let's think about that a little bit. The sins of the father are visited unto the seventh generation. That means that the small changes or the things that we might be doing now, we have no idea, or we're not even thinking about or considering how the changes we're making now might impact on our children's 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 children, successive generations. And the seventh generation has said there very deliberately, I believe, because in certainly many traditional First Nation societies, thinking First Nation are residents of Turtle Island, as they call it in North America, but when making decisions to consider with the impact of that decision, how it might affect on on the seventh successive generation from now. This is very, very far from our Western thinking. We've got into a very short time frame thinking. We want instant return, instant yields, and we're really not thinking about the long-term downstream effects of what we're doing. In fact, we're obtaining yields at a rate much faster than nature can replenish, and so we're experiencing nature's limits in many different ways. Whether collapsing insect populations, we've lost 70% of insects in or more in Western Europe in recent decades. That's a sign of a system collapse. That's very, very, very worrying. Um, uh, so the words, nature has limits. If we fail to regulate our actions and observe visible signs of stress, um, and observe it, so then we risk causing long-term damage. Well, we're getting the planet is feeding back. We're hearing it loud and clear. Bushfires, wild animals invading into human spaces, the planetary, the global climate crisis. But I mean, soil loss. We can observe the impacts of system erosive impact into systems everywhere we look. Whether it's streams filling up with plastic bottles or to uh, nature has limits, and if we fail to regulate our actions and observe the visible signs of stress, then we risk causing long-term damage. Well, we know that we're already causing long-term damage, and within permaculture, we are thinking about and understanding that also with systems thinking, we can reverse those processes. You can send it back in the other direction, but only by observing and interacting, catching and storing energy, developing yields, and then understanding that nature has limits and to work with those limits. It's essential to consider the short, medium, and long term consequences of the design decisions that we make. Don't just think about putting a building up, thinking about how long it's going to live, and then think about how you're going to take it down again and what's going to happen to those materials at the end of its life. Short, medium, and long term. Traditional societies recognized that the effects of external negative feedback controls are often slow to emerge. People needed explanations and warnings, such as the sins of the father are visited on the children unto the seventh generation. So there you have it. So think about how and when. So think about how and when we ride a bike, the rider makes constant adjustments to compensate for the uneven road or their shifting weight as they cycle. So that constant feedback and adjustment creates a dynamic equilibrium and the stability in a changing environment. So there you go. I think it's a great metaphor. Is the way that you propel yourself along on a bike down a bumpy road with your weight shifting around as you pedal. You constantly make little adjustments. You respond to feedback so you don't wobble off the road. The lesson within Principle 4 is that we have to accept feedback, and that feedback can be subtle and it might be indicating long-term effect, but we need to listen carefully for it and we need to act upon it. This is what makes you a permaculture designer. If you're not actively seeking and working and accepting the feedback from the design decisions that you're making, then you cannot learn and you cannot progress. So we can work with nature, we can push nature, we can see how it goes and how far we can get with it, but it has understanding that it has limits, and when we start pushing it too far, it'll let us know. And a very simple way that nature sometimes gives you feedback is you get imbalances of species. So if you've suddenly got a lot of grasshoppers, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to go to war with grasshoppers. It means maybe the predatory birds, like, I don't know, turkeys or ground feeding, running birds that maybe eat grasshoppers, maybe they're missing from the system, or large lizards or something, is remembering that everything's connected. In nature, we need to let go of our ideas of perhaps good and bad, and which is the weeds and pests and so forth, and understand that those are all elements of the system, and all we're doing is subtly manipulating that system to fulfill our needs, to create yields for ourselves, but not at the expense of the whole system and the other elements within it, because we might not understand how they contribute to it yet. It doesn't mean that they don't. It just means you don't quite know what that funny caterpillar, how important that might be to other functions within the system. The picture I chose today for the background picture is a wonderful team Yeah, this is in Uganda at Kamuli High School, and what we're seeing is the guys are building an intervention to catch the runoff from the roof of that classroom building, and they're anticipating a sort of a cascading effect. There's water coming off that roof because soak that into the ground, into a series of swales and banana circles. That extra humidity might enable us to establish trees and shrubs which have deep enough roots to get through the dry season. They've tried to grow annual crops here before and not had success. Um, they're going to start a sequence which can build on itself in the way that nature can build and regenerate. So this is they're thinking in systems. They're strategically putting elements in the right place. Different things like the water trapment trenches and contours that they're working with, the strategic placement of trees and other plants to intercept the flow of water, to actually build a system that's better at holding water than what it was before. So we're using the catch and storing energy idea to create yields, and those yields then begin to work together as a system, which then feeds back and educates the people around about how to take care of that system and how to build it and extend it and ultimately replicate it. So think of the many yields that might come from that, from the interactions, the friendship, there's the work, the experiential learning, and then the resulting yields that come from the leaves, the trees, the fruits, the birds of ultimately of that forest garden, that food forest that we planted there. Okay, welcome to Principle 4. Welcome to systems, limits, and feedback. And so many things to think about in this day.